Good evening, and welcome to Leesville First Baptist Church. We're still in the book of Daniel for our Wednesday night Bible study. We're up to chapter 8. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. Lord, we confess that it's been a dream of ours to see what Daniel saw. And many of us have prayed for that, to be used by you in a mighty way. We forget what kind of man Daniel was, his faithfulness to you, his courage. And we also confess that we are sinners, saved by grace. And we lean totally upon your mercy. Still, we beg that you would teach us what Daniel saw, that you would help us profit from it, not just for our personal excitement or joy or satisfaction, but that we might be better servants of you. Help us, for we beg in Jesus' name tonight. Amen. We've switched back to Hebrew. I think I mentioned in the past weeks that we begin in Aramaic, which was the general language of the day. The local nations, they would speak their own language, but they also spoke Aramaic. And just as Greek became the overall language in the Roman world, Aramaic was. So the first books up till now have been to a Gentile and Jewish audience. But now we're in Hebrew, and that's on purpose. Because now we're talking to just God's people. In particular, we're talking Jewish prophecy. It's assumed by most Protestant Christians that after the rapture, there'll be a large number of Jews who will become Christian. I made fun of Hal Lindsey a couple of times in previous Bible studies. Let me point out a good thing he said, where he calls them basically 144,000 Jewish Billy Grahams. When the Jews find out that the rapture has happened and they begin to get saved, they're going to be motivated. And they're going to be great evangelists, which is necessary at the end of time, but also a measure of God's mercy. At the end of time will come perhaps the greatest evangelical push of all time. Yes, the Antichrist will be in power. Yes, he will be torturing Christians. But Christians all over the world will be, lost people all over the world will be blessed by a huge number of Christian missionaries. All of them evangelists who are going to preach the gospel till they die. So we're back into Hebrew, because this is as it affects the Jews. Paul tells us in Romans that the Jews were grafted off the vine of the church, of the people of God, but only for a time. Christianity and Judaism are separate now, and have been since Jesus was crucified. But one day, large numbers of Jews will be saved, and it'll come after Christians leave. So we're still living in the time of the Gentiles, but the last days will be the time of the Jewish people again. Christians, yes, with a lot of Gentile Christians being saved, because these will be such great missionaries, great evangelists. But it's still going to be powered by the Jewish nation. I saw in the vision, and so it happened while I was looking, that he's in bed, that I was in Shushan, the citadel. Now, that was Cyrus's construction, and it's back in the middle of the home area of the Persians. Babylon and a couple of other places were the real capitals of the empire. But Shushan, also pronounced Susa depending on the culture, that place was home. Like George Washington going home to Mount Vernon. And I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. It was that river, which is also called a canal because portions of it were cut to make it easier for travel. The king had it cut so he could move big ships up and down it and supply his capital with whatever materials he wanted. Alexander the Great is going to use that same river to bring his boats up it to destroy the citadel when he conquers Persia. Verse 3, I lifted my eyes and saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram which had two horns. Now, the Persians and the Medes of that day were a pastoral people. They traveled. They were nomadic. They had herds. There were basically two types of economies back then. There was the farming society, and there was the stock animal. They didn't use stockyard animals, but moving stocks, like herds of sheep and herds of goats, herds of cattle. The Persians and Medes were great horsemen, and so they traveled with their herds on horseback. They became great at fighting on horses, and that gave them a huge advantage against other peoples. So they grew. And as they grew, their herds got bigger, their food got bigger. They ate better and became bigger and stronger. It snowballed until they were conquering everybody. This ram had two horns. Remember in Revelation I told you that horns are symbolic of power. In this case, the two powers are the Medes and the Persians, two tribes that were so close they eventually merged into the Persian Empire. One was higher than the other. They were both high. They were both great horns. They were both very powerful, but one was more powerful. And the higher one came up last. The Medes had kind of started the Confederation, but the Persians took over. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward. Didn't go west. Didn't go east because that would have been into India, and India was very wealthy and had paid for great armies. India was a mishmash of municipalities, but it was kind of not worth it to attack them. So instead, the Medes and Persians, they went north. They went south into Egypt even. And they went westward as far as Greece. They tried to conquer Greece, but conquered about half of it. They got all the way down, couldn't conquer Sparta. And so the Greeks were able to hold on because they had still a foothold of their own property, and they fought the Persians off eventually. So that no animal could withstand him, nor was there anyone that could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will, did what he wanted to do, and became great. Great there in the Hebrew means big. At one point, it was the biggest empire in the history of mankind. Stretching from Greece, as you're looking at it from Greece, to Egypt, to way above in the Caucasus area, and all of the Middle East. As I was considering, as I was thinking about that, suddenly a male goat, literally in the Hebrew, a hairy male goat, a mountain goat. I'll go ahead and give you the spoiler. It's a Macedonian goat. Macedon conquered Greece, and together they conquered, well, we'll talk about Alexander the Great in a minute. But a male goat came from the west, from Greece and Macedonia, across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. Alexander the Great was such a great general. He was a military genius, probably a genius in every other way too. He was a 7-year student of the great philosopher Aristotle, for whom a large part of science was inspired. It was the writings of Aristotle that basically fueled the Renaissance search for knowledge in the form of science. Aristotle was the student of Plato. Plato was the student of Socrates. So Alexander the Great is the beneficiary of perhaps the greatest education of his age, and an education that would rival most of the ones we have today. He was well learned. He read military strategy always. It said that he would be found in a quiet moment reading either military strategy or philosophy or art. He conquered so fast. He conquered he conquered all the Persian Empire. He went from Macedonia, conquering down to Greece, conquered the Persian Empire, conquered, which means Egypt, Middle East, Persia, was declared a god in Egypt, was making headway into India, and making plans to go into China when his army, his own soldiers said, "We're done. We want to take our money and go home." He died soon after that of what we don't know. Maybe a fever. Maybe he drank himself to death. But he was so well educated in military science that he would appear on the battlefield, take stock in what was going on, make a strategy on the spot, and execute it and win the battle in moments. It helps that his army, is called the Phalanx, was perhaps the first to be great in close order drilling. They moved as a unit. Because the Persians' major weapon, well, they had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. It said when Xerxes attacked Greece the first time, he had an army of 1 million, which is just impossible to imagine. But he also had chariots with 8-foot blades on them. Some would have as big as 11 feet. And since everyone else fought with loosely gathered soldiers, he would simply ride through with armored horses and an armored chariot with the blades, and he would slice up the ground soldiers. Those chariots were a terrible thing to behold, but not for Alexander. He would simply give the order, and his soldiers would step to the side, let the chariots fly by where they would either hit them with an arrow or with a javelin and kill them from behind as they blew. He totally destroyed the Persians. Said, as I was considering, a male goat suddenly came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, in other words, speed, and the goat had a notable horn. He was very powerful, Alexander the Great level of power. between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had two horns, the Medo-Persian Empire, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him. The Persians had attacked Greece. They had set fire to the city of Athens. Alexander the Great used that anger. They fought for revenge. When they came back, they were ready and angry. He attacked the ram, literally struck the ram, and broke his two horns, broke his power, broke the power of the Medes, broke the power of the Persians. It said that Darius II, the king of Persia, ran the first time he fought Alexander the Great, and ran so fast that he left his own family behind. His mother, the queen mother, was so angry with him that she disowned him and adopted Alexander. Well, it may have been politics, the reason she did that, maybe not. Alexander the Great was very attractive and everyone was impressed with him. Men and women were impressed with him. But it said there was no power in the ram to withstand him. History tells us that Darius ran the second time and a third time, and the fourth time when he ran, his own soldiers were so disgusted by his cowardice that they killed him. And that ended the Persian Empire. There was no power in the ram to withstand him. There was nothing the Persians could do to stop Alexander. Remember, we're talking about Persian chariots that are ineffective. That was their major weapon. And foot soldiers who were wearing linen instead of armor, running with either barefoot or with sandals on. And as a shield, they would have wicker. Not even wood, wicker shields, because they were going for speed against heavily armored Macedonian troops. Armor on their chest, on their legs, on their feet, helmets on their head, large shields in their hands, and 18-foot pikes in their hands. And you're going to run half-naked men into that. He chewed up the Persian army. He cast him to the ground and trampled him. And there was no one that could deliver the ram from his head. Nobody could save the Persian Empire. Therefore, the male goat grew very great. He wasn't just great like the Persian Empire, he was very great. But when he became strong, at the moment Alexander the Great won everything, the large horn was broken. Again, Alexander the Great died. 33 years old, he died. And in place of it, 4 notable ones came up towards the 4 winds of heaven. It said that on his deathbed, they asked Alexander the Great, who is going to inherit your kingdom? And to which he responded, the strongest one. It's notable for us to realize here that they didn't fight for national pride, as we talk about today. They didn't fight for national security. They didn't fight to defend themselves. This army fought for profit. The generals were there for profit. Alexander couldn't just win the battle. He had to win in expensive places so that his soldiers could afterwards steal all the gold and silver and whatever else valuables they could find. They were all just mercenary at heart. And so when Alexander died, the 4 strongest generals killed all their opposition and grabbed hold each one of a quarter of Alexander's empire. Now that's about 320, 330 BC. About 170, a historical character comes. Last week I told you that the little horn was the Antichrist. And I said, but next week, chapter 8, we're going to talk about Antiochus Epiphanes. That was his name. He's the little horn, only it's actually both. And I'll explain how it has to be both. But this man, Antiochus Epiphanes, and the Antichrist are the same kind of man. The same kind of thinker, the same kind of scoundrel. Antiochus' real name was Mithridates, but he changed it to Antiochus Epiphanes, which means God manifest, God in the flesh. Now, you might think he was being symbolic or sarcastic, except that his friends called him not God in the flesh, but God the insane. He was full of himself. Out of them, verse 9, out of these four kingdoms came a little horn, a little power, that grew exceedingly great. Toward the south, Egypt, he conquered most of Egypt. Toward the east, almost to Syria. And towards the glorious land, he conquered Israel. And the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees in the Apocrypha talk about the Greek, Macedonian and Greek occupation of the promised land of Israel. And it grew up to the host of heaven. The little horn grew up to be so big and so powerful, he was up there in heaven. And it cast down some of the host and some of the stars on the ground and trampled them. Do you understand that we're not just talking about Antiochus here, though? We're also talking about the Antichrist. From now on, you've got to see both of them in the same light. The Antichrist will be so successful at the end of time that nobody can stop him. He even cast down some of the host, the angels, but also the children of God on earth. We're told in Revelation that he takes a third of the angels with him. I said in Revelation, the revelation of Jesus Christ, that you can't read that without also reading Daniel. And now we see why. And he trampled them. In other words, he destroyed them utterly. He won. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, as the prince of heaven. And whether we're talking about Antiochus or whether we're talking about the Antichrist, we're talking about Jesus. He exalted himself as high as Jesus. And by him, the daily sacrifices were taken away. Now, you will have critics say I'm wrong, because this perfectly fits Antiochus. And it does. But I'm going to, in just a minute, when the time comes, I'm going to show you how it can't be Antiochus. And don't worry, I'm on solid Orthodox Christian ground here. Most conservative Christian scholars agree that this is also about the Antichrist. And you'll see why in a minute. He took away the daily sacrifices. Antiochus stopped the Jews from offering sacrifices. It said that he butchered a pig, which was an abomination to the Jews. He butchered a pig on the altar in the Jewish temple. And as I said earlier, opened up the worship to other gods, and even mapped out areas where the other gods could have their priests and their idols and their worshipers. He was a cultural snob who intended to force the Jews to become Greek in their philosophy. It may be hard for many of us to understand just what drove Alexander, the philosophy that drove him. But he really was a snob who believed that the Greek way of thinking was the only way of thinking. And you and I more than likely are the end result of his philosophy. Western civilization came from Alexander the Great. You could argue it came from Socrates. You could argue that Plato codified it, wrote the philosophy for it. You could argue that Aristotle codified it, but it was Alexander the Great who took a sword and made it happen. And so Antiochus here is going to force these stupid Jewish rednecks, as he saw them, to see the light of day and become Western, to become Greek, just as you and I are today. He won over a large portion of the world, all of Western civilization. Verse 12, because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn. The horn is going to win because of sin. In Antiochus' day, because of the sin of the Jews, but in our day, because of our sin. We are sinful people who live in the midst of sinful people. And we suffer from that. And when the Antichrist comes, he will be legitimized because we tolerated sin. Because we looked the other way. So an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices. And he cast truth down to the ground. We see that happening today. Where what is good is considered evil. What is evil is considered good. We're doing things today that are so perverted that my grandparents would have laughed if I'd told them we were going to do these things. But we do it and call it good today. Then I heard a holy one speaking, heard an angel, didn't say which one, doesn't matter. And another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation? The giving of both the sanctuary and the host, remember the sanctuary is the temple, to be trampled underfoot. Well, Jesus says that this is in the future. Yes, it refers back to Antiochus, but it also refers forward to the Antichrist. Jesus says in Matthew 24, starting with verse 9, they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations, all racial groups, for my name's sake, for being Christian. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. And many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. He's talking about pseudo-Christian and pseudo-Jewish groups that will rise up and gather adherents. People who will believe what they say is a new type of Christianity or a new type of Judaism, but instead becomes just a heresy, just a cult. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. We can't love one another when we begin to say they're getting benefits that I don't get. They're breaking the law and getting away with it. And pretty soon you hear both sides saying the other side's getting away with breaking the law. And when that happens, our love grows cold. There will be a time then of universal hatred to the point of murder. We will be ready to kill each other. But he who endures to the end. So he's not talking about just staying Christian. Too many of us read this, I'm going to just stay Christian. He means those who can keep on loving with a Christian love. Those who can keep pure. Who can stay righteous when everyone around them is filthy, and hate-filled. He who endures to the end shall be saved. What makes us different is we have the love of Christ within us. And if you don't have the love of Christ, you need to be certain about your salvation. You need to go back to the beginning and check to see if you're really saved. Jesus ordered us to love our enemies. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations. As the lost are hating us and killing us, they're going to see our behavior, and that will be a gospel preached to them, a witness given to them that will lead many of them to the Lord. I've mentioned this before in Revelation, but I've talked to people in our International Mission Board who are telling me that in the nations where Christians are being killed, it seems to be 2 to 1. For every Christian who gets killed, 2 Muslims get saved. And they remark, they watch the Christians die and notice the peace they had and the confidence they had in Jesus and the confidence they had in their own salvation. And these Muslims said they wanted the same thing. A Christian being Christian when he's being tormented is a testimony to the lost. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, what we called here the transgression of desolation earlier, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, whoever reads, let him understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. Let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such has not been seen since the beginning of the world. We're not talking about, again, we're not talking about Antiochus now. We're talking about the Antichrist, nor shall ever be. So Jesus is saying, from the book of, referring to the book of Daniel, the Antichrist is in the future. He and Antiochus are alike. They're the same kind of brutal, murderous, conniving, but brilliant political leaders. But Antiochus is around 165 BC when he destroyed the temple, when he desecrated the temple, and the Antichrist is sometime in the future. Verse 14, he said to me, for 2,300 days, when one angel said to the other, how long? Then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Now, if we're talking about 2,300 years, and I'm going to play a game with you, then from 165 up to now, we're talking about 2144. In other words, 122 years from now. Wow, the pastor just told us when the end of time's coming. No, I didn't. Remember, in Matthew, Jesus also says, no one knows. I've said that 100 times. I'm going to say it 100 more times. Anybody who comes up with a method to tell you how to compute the end of time is wrong. Nobody will know until it's over with. But I said that to tell you that there were people who tried to calculate 2,300 years. They tried to move it back a little bit. The Seventh-day Adventists, they counted a day a year and had it end up in their math that the world was going to end in 1844. That would be the second coming of Jesus. Well, it's the year 2022, and 1844 is come and gone. I'm pretty sure Jesus didn't come back. I want to point out again, you just can't know the time. It could mean a number of things. When it says 2,300 days, it literally says morning days, morning evenings. Morning evenings. Since there was a morning sacrifice and an evening sacrifice, many people believe, and I think they've got a good point, that would be 2,300 sacrifices, which would actually be 1,150 total days. Or in the Jewish calendar, which is 360 days instead of 365, in the Jewish calendar, it would be 3 years and 70 days. Then it happened, which, by the way, is pretty close to what John tells us in the revelation of Jesus Christ in the midst of the 7 years, in the 3.5 year period. Then it happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man, an angel who looks like a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, who called and said, Gabriel, this is the only place in the Bible, Daniel is the only book in the Bible that names the angels. Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. This is right out of the revelation of Jesus Christ. But he said to me, understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. We're talking about the end of time. By the way, those scholars who say that all of this is in the past, they believe it was written by a 2nd century AD writer who thought he was talking about the end of time. But obviously that's wrong. You're left with if you're going to agree with those scholars, you have to say that Jesus was wrong, that John was wrong. But if Jesus is wrong, well, close up shop and go home. The Orthodox conservative Christians believe in the word of Jesus. So this is about the future. This is about the Antichrist. This is about the time of tribulation, the 7-year period. Now, as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. I was passed out, but he touched me and stood me upright. And he said, look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation. It's disgusting what the Antichrist is going to do. It'd be a period of indignation. For at the appointed time, the end shall be. The end of time is coming at a particular time. The ram which you saw having 2 horns, they are the kings or the kingdoms of Media and Persia. And the male goat, the hairy male goat, is the kingdom or the king literally of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. As for the broken horn and the 4 who stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall rise out of that nation. As I mentioned earlier, the 4 generals who won a lot of military actions and a lot more poisoning, by the way, for it to come out to these 4 generals, but not with its power. These 4 kingdoms will never be as strong as Alexander the Great. And in the latter time of their kingdoms, at the end of Western civilization, which we now know would be probably the end of time, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, you think it's bad now. In the time of the Antichrist, the people of sin, the transgressors, will have reached their full power. No matter how bad you think sin is today, it's going to get worse. A king shall, when the full transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise. The Antichrist is so evil and so filthy, he can only arise when the world has become so sinful around him that he fits in. Your battle to be a bright light where you are, your personal battle to be Christian and to Christianize your circle of influence, fights back the coming of the Antichrist. But one day, sin's going to reach its completion. Having fierce features, a fierce face, it means his personality is angry and passionate and powerful. Who understands sinister schemes. In the Hebrew rather, that literally means dark wisdom. He knows ways to do things, to influence people, to push people to his way of thinking. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power, meaning that he's a servant of the devil. And his power comes from Satan. The Antichrist is not Alexander the Great, but he'll have the power of Satan behind him. And he shall destroy fearfully. King James translates that he shall destroy wonderfully. And what it really means is extraordinarily. He is going to destroy in ways that just amaze you. And shall prosper and thrive. He will become powerful and grow and grow and grow in money and influence. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. The Antichrist will kill Christians. So many of my friends in college said they wish they could be here when Jesus comes back. I think when that day comes, the Christians are going to say, I wish I'd lived a generation earlier, who lived and served the Lord and died peacefully. Because the Antichrist is going to be unstoppable. It will be depressing how easily he wins and how completely he wins. Through his cunning, his dark schemes, he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule. Lies become normal. We saw little bits of that in the former Soviet Union, where the people knew that the state newspaper and state television news, they knew they were being lied to. The Antichrist will perfect it. He will make lies what everyone has to believe. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. Many who are strong and powerful, that won't matter. He'll still destroy them. He shall even rise against the Prince of Princes. He will rise up against Jesus. But he shall be broken without human means. That's New King James translates that human means. It literally in the Hebrew, he shall be broken without hands, because he's going to be defeated not by humans, but by Jesus Christ. In Revelation, we're told that he just fails. It's not like it's a big battle and he gets beaten. Jesus just speaks and the Antichrist is destroyed. And the vision of the evenings and mornings which was told is true. He will win. And it will be hell on earth for 3.5 years. Therefore, seal up the vision. Now, in Revelation, the question is asked, who is worthy to open the scroll and to read what's inside? And we're told only Jesus is. You and I, only the Lamb who is slain is. Only Jesus, now that he's been crucified, dead, and buried, and resurrected, can read that scroll. We don't know, and we won't know. For it refers to many days in the future. So the 2,300 morning and evening worships, if you want to take it that way, the three and a portion years, refers to many days in the future. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterwards I arose and went about the king's business. I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. The Daniel who could discern the meaning of dreams. The genius who could understand any dream just can't get the meaning of this because he's not allowed to. Just as you and I are not allowed to. We don't get to know who the Antichrist is. We don't get to know when he's coming. We don't get to say, there's the Antichrist, be careful around him. It's just going to happen. Real quick, a couple of things. Notice that this is telling us that the temple will be rebuilt at the end of time. Right now, there's a Muslim shrine over the place where the temple has to go. It's called the Dome of the Rock. And it is a major Muslim religious shrine, and it would be almost a world war if it were destroyed. And yet, the Bible is telling us at the end of time, the Antichrist is going to stand in the middle of the temple, declare himself to be God, and desecrate the temple. Now that tells us that the temple will be rebuilt. I don't know if an earthquake happens. I don't know if a meteor crashes and destroys the temple and the Israelis take it back over. I don't know. But the Bible says that the temple will be rebuilt, and there's only one place it can be rebuilt. And that's exactly at the Dome of the Rock, which was the threshing floor of Ornan that King David bought so that he could put a temple that Solomon built. There will be a temple on that spot one day. How do we know then the end of time's not here? Well, there's no temple for the Antichrist to stand in yet. But that's just a detail. It's the kind of games we play with Revelation, and with revelation of Jesus Christ, and with Daniel. But what's important to note is what Jesus said. He who endures to the end. He who can love when everybody else is hating. He who can forgive and show mercy and be Christian in his heart, in his righteousness, in his holiness, in his faithfulness to God, will be saved. If you miss everything else I'm saying, and I know there's fantastic prophecy in here, and ain't it fun? But if you miss that point, that we have to endure to the end, that we have to remain Christian, we have to worship, we have to pray, we have to serve God, no matter how tempting the devil makes it for us to go in other directions. If we endure to the end, we will be saved. Please think about that as we go into our week, as we get ready Sunday for church. Can you endure to the end? Will you endure to the end? Aren't you determined to? As we think about that, in Christ's service and in yours, I am your pastor. Good night.